We are thrilled to have with us three experts from the National Association of State Budget Officers. They're going to talk about the budget process, about revenue numbers, about what the last year has looked like, and then we'll have time for Q&A. We have with us Shelby Kearns, who is Executive Director at NASBO, and before coming to NASBO, she was the Deputy Director at the Idaho Department of Labor. Brian Sigritz is Director of the State Fiscal Studies Division at NASBO, where he tracks and analyzes tax and revenue trends and handles activities related to transportation, public-private partnerships, energy, and disaster response issues. Catherine Vesey-White is Director of Budget Process Studies at NASBO, and she is author of the semi-annual Fiscal Survey of States report. We have these folks until 12:15 Eastern, and they're going to present, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. And so I'm going to turn it over to Shelby, and Jeff, if you want to pull the slideshow back up. But Shelby and Brian and Catherine, welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for inviting us to join you today. A little bit about NASBO, for those of you who aren't familiar with us. For more than 75 years, the National Association of State Budget Officers has been the professional membership organization for state budget and finance officers, the chief financial advisors to the nation's governors. NASBO members guide their states in analysis of budget options and the formation of sound public policy. State budgets have been in the news more than probably any time since the Great Recession. And the bright side for us at NASBO is that it's a time when other people are as interested in these issues as we are. However, I spent a decade in the Idaho Budget Office, and I know from experience that State House reporters are probably the only people who are always as interested in the details and minutiae of government as state budget officers are. So I always appreciated your Idaho colleagues when I worked in the budget office there, and we appreciate all your work as we follow state budget news from around the country. We're taking a little bit of a different approach today. We're going to take a kind of a roundtable approach. We've organized our presentation time around the questions that we receive most from national and state reporters, and we'll take turns addressing issues and filling in gaps where we think maybe our colleagues missed something. So the first slide that we have, Jeff, if you can go to that slide, is just talking a little bit about the current state fiscal environment. Most of the data that we're sharing today is from NASBO's 2020 Fall Fiscal Survey, which we released in December. That survey collects information on states' enacted budgets. It's really important to note that the data represents a point in time when a state completed the survey, and those points in time differ by state, depending on when the state enacted its budget for fiscal 2021, and also how often a state revises its revenue forecast. So the budget figures in the survey were enacted as long ago as April 2019 for some states with biennial budgets, and as recently as September 2020. These points in time are always important and they always exist in any of our surveys, but conditions have changed so rapidly over the past year that timing has more of a pronounced effect than normal. So I do want to make sure that we point that out. We found that after 9 consecutive years of growth, states saw revenues decline in fiscal 2020, and greater declines are forecasted for fiscal 2021, leading to enacted budgets for fiscal 2021 calling for the first general fund spending decrease since the Great Recession. The impact of the pandemic on state revenue has been uneven. Energy producing states and those that are dependent upon tourism and with higher unemployment rates are seeing greater impact, and states with economies that are more reliant upon services are being hit harder. Tax structures and virus transmission levels also affect the impact on state revenue. The collection of online sales tax has been vital to states, something that I think we all understand by the number of Amazon deliveries in our neighborhoods, but we don't always stop to consider what would have happened to state revenue if this had all happened prior to the Wayfair decision. Revenue estimating and budgeting have always been extraordinarily challenging during this time. As the conditions quickly evolve and there's been a high level of uncertainty around the virus, it's been even more so. This presentation will dig into each of these points in more detail, and we'll start by looking at the revenue side of state budgets. Next slide.
So this slide looks at state general fund revenue. So general fund revenue is the biggest source of state revenue. And typically when you think about general fund revenue, it's the major sources of tax collections in the states, things like personal income taxes and sales taxes. States also receive revenues from other sources that aren't captured in the general fund. One of the largest being gas taxes that go specifically for transportation, things like state park fees, also higher education fees and tuition that must be spent in the higher education area. But the general fund revenues are typically the most flexible, and it's really how states fund their general fund budgets. So this looks at the breakdown for all 50 states of where they receive their general fund revenues from. Personal income taxes are the biggest for all 50 states, with sales taxes being second. Should be noted that some states don't have either a personal income tax or a sales tax, so there are some variation amongst states here. And the other kind of interesting thing to note about this slide is that these percentages have remained relatively constant over the past 15, 20 years, where we've consistently seen personal income tax being the largest and sales taxes coming in second. And next slide.
And so in addition to some of the variation that Brian touched on regarding where states get their revenue, I wanted to take a moment to note how states vary in the processes that they use to forecast revenue and how frequently they revise estimates. This was something Shelby mentioned in her opening as well. So a state's revenue forecast, of course, is a critical component of the state budget process. Going into budget development, it will tell elected officials how much resources the state will have to support expenditures. And also during the fiscal year, forecast revisions can be what prompt officials to decide to scale back on spending or take other budget actions in the event of a forecasted revenue shortfall, as we saw in numerous cases last year. So the process followed for producing official revenue estimates for the budget does differ considerably across the states. Just over half of states develop what's known as a consensus forecast, which is adhered to by both the governor and the legislature in budgeting. With a consensus forecast process, a revenue estimating group, including members representing both the executive and legislative branches, as well as often other experts, such as a Council of Economic Advisors, will work together to reach agreement on the state's underlying economic assumptions and develop the state's revenue forecast. Among the rest of the states that don't follow a consensus process, about half have what's referred to as competing forecasts, one developed by the executive and another developed by the legislative branch. And then in the rest of states, the executive branch is solely responsible for revenue forecasting. Another way states vary is how frequently they release official actionable revenue estimates. Many states release official revenue forecasts 2 or 3 times a year, typically, and these are usually timed around key milestones in the budget process, such as before or concurrent with the governor's budget release, and then again with adoption of the budget by the legislature. However, some states release official revenue estimates 4 or more times each year, while others may only release estimates generally once per year, or even less in the cases of some biennial budget states. So over the past year, this variation has had important implications for when information became available for how COVID-19 was affecting states' revenues and budget outlooks. And this also helps explain in part why some states acted sooner than others in response to COVID-19. And this is, as Shelby mentioned earlier, another important reason why the state-by-state data on revenues, which we have and Shelby will walk through in a moment, reflects differing points in time depending on the state. Next slide.
If we actually go to the next slide, we can just jump into these numbers that Catherine was kind of alluding to. This slide shows the impact that the pandemic has had on those general fund revenue sources. The fiscal 2021 figures are based on states' most current revenue estimates at the time of data collection. And then those are compared to preliminary actual revenues for fiscal 2020. It's also important to note that these numbers are not adjusted for the impact of the tax deadline shift. So that deflated fiscal 2020 revenues and then inflated fiscal 2021 revenues. Just another strange nuance that we had this year. Another thing to note is that some states' fiscal 2021 most current estimates still were predating COVID-19. Next slide. So since states budget on a revenue projection, it is important for us to show those comparisons to the pre-COVID projections. Before the COVID-19 crisis hit, states were expecting general fund revenue growth of 2.9% in fiscal 2020 and 3% in fiscal 2021. Compared to those pre-COVID projections, preliminary actual fiscal 2020 general fund collections declined 3.8%, and fiscal 2021 estimates reported in the fall show a decline of 10.8%. That represents a $135 billion projected general fund only loss over kind of a roughly 15-month period. It's also important to note when looking at these projections that tax collections, particularly from income tax, will lag economic downturns. So with states projecting consecutive years of general fund revenue declines in fiscal 2020 and fiscal 2021, it adds uncertainty around how long it will take for state budgets to fully recover. Just as a comparison, after the Great Recession, even though revenues began to grow again in fiscal 2011, it took until fiscal 2013 for state general fund revenue to surpass its fiscal 2008 levels without adjusting for inflation. States did not see revenue fully restored to fiscal 2008 levels until fiscal 2018 in inflation adjusted terms. So we've seen some positive developments more recently around the state revenue picture, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. So we'll turn to the spending side of the state budget right now. Before we share some data on how states adjusted their spending plans as a result of weakened revenue projections, Brian will talk about kind of an overview on how states spend their money based on data from NASBO's state expenditure report.
Great, thanks, Shelby. You can skip ahead 2 slides, to slide 10, I believe. So all this data for the next handful of slides comes from our state expenditure report, as Shelby noted. Our state expenditure report is published annually, and it breaks down state spending by both fund source and by program area. We've been doing the report since 1987. And I should note too that all of our reports, our state expenditure, our fiscal survey, budget process in the states, and our weekly publications, they're all available for free on our website if you ever want to check them out. You can also sign up for our website if you want to start receiving some of our weekly publications too. So this might be a good resource for you if you want to learn more about some information we're presenting here today. So this first slide is looking at total state expenditures by fund source. So where states get their money from. So you can see that general funds are the biggest piece of the pie, with federal funds second, and that's remained consistent throughout the years. We have seen a shift though, as far as the percentage between general funds and federal funds. This year in 2020, federal funds started making up a little bit higher percentage, and general funds declined and federal funds started making up a little higher bit of percentage. And that was directly due to the additional federal funds provided to states through the CARES Act and some of the other coronavirus relief bills. There's a good chance that when we look at this again in fiscal 2021, we'll see that general fund piece shrink even further as states continue to receive more federal dollars through the CARES Act. So far, though, the shift hasn't been as great as what we saw during the Great Recession with the Recovery Act or the ARA dollars. At that point, federal funds made up even a higher percentage of the pie. Next slide. So this looks at total state expenditures by program area. So here, once again, this includes general funds, federal funds, other state funds, and bonds. So Medicaid has now made up the biggest percentage of total state expenditures since 2007, with K-12 being second. The interesting thing to note here, although Medicaid spending still grew this past year in 2020, that all other categories saw the largest increase. So all other percentage increased higher than any other areas. And once again, this is directly related to what was going on with COVID-19. If you look at CARES Act spending, where the funds were going to, it was largely in that all other area. So things like public health spending, emergency management, unemployment assistance, broadband expansion, all those sort of things that fall under that all other category. So that's why we saw the largest increases in all other in fiscal 2020. Next slide. So this looks at general fund expenditures. As I kind of noted when talking about general fund revenues, general funds are the biggest piece of the pie, they're the most flexible. Often when you think about state budgets and you're looking at governor's budget proposals, you're primarily focusing on the general fund piece. So unlike when you look at total state expenditures, when you look at general fund dollars, K-12 is still by far the largest percentage of state spending. And that has remained consistent throughout the years. That general fund spending percentage has relatively stayed the same for the last 10 years or so. We've seen increases in the Medicaid percentage, but it really hasn't been at expense of the K-12 category. It's really been, and we've seen declines in other areas, specifically higher education when you look at that general fund category. And next slide. And so here, this one looks at federal funds dollars to states, and Medicaid now represents over half of all federal funds to states. I think it was in 2015, Medicaid became over half of all federal funds to states for the first time. So that was partly due to the passage of the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, although we had seen that trend even before Medicaid expansion, where Medicaid was making up a growing piece of federal funds to states. This year in 2020, here once again, that Medicaid percentage declined a little bit, and we saw larger growth in the all other category. And that was for the same reasons I was discussing earlier with the coronavirus relief bills that have been passed by the federal government. Next slide.
Now we'll just we'll cover a little bit how states adjusted their spending over the COVID-19 crisis. So this slide shows that preliminary actual general fund spending for fiscal 2020 came in at $903.1 billion. That's a 4% annual increase. You can see that states enacted budgets for fiscal 2021 are projected to reduce general fund spending by 1.1% compared to those preliminary actual fiscal 2020 levels. Again, that's the first time states have enacted a net spending decrease in more than a decade. And as Brian talked about, a lot of that over time can be offset by federal fund expenditures. You see a shift, but they're not always the same expenditures either. Next slide. And again, it's important to remember that states budget on a revenue projection, and this slide compares spending to what states were expecting to spend prior to the pandemic. So while actual general fund spending for fiscal 2020 did increase, it was 1.7% below the level that states were expecting to spend prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And that really does speak to that severe rapid impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Like I said, there's usually a lag between the start of an economic downturn and then the state fiscal stress that necessitates spending reductions. The pandemic and the ensuing economic impacts also hit late in the fiscal year, which made it hard for states to rely too much on spending cuts to close the budget shortfall. You've spent a lot by that fourth quarter, but states did take steps to rein in spending for the remainder of the year. Compared to governor's budget proposals for fiscal 2021, released by most states just a few months earlier, states enacted budgets show a 5.5% or $52 billion reduction in general fund spending. Next slide. So as I said, states had to adjust their spending plans in the spring and summer compared to what the governors recommended in the winter, just due to that rapid transformation of state fiscal conditions. K-12 education saw the largest reduction, and higher education, transportation, and all other government programs saw net decreases as well. Medicaid and public assistance saw sizable increases in spending, reflecting rising caseloads and spending pressures for health and human services as a result of the economic downturn. So far, 10 states have reported approving net reductions post-enactment for fiscal 2021 due to a revenue shortfall. So we're seeing that continue into 2021 as well. One of the things that's often comes up is that why are states cutting education? That's the priority, but it's also where the largest chunk of the money is. So you definitely, when you have to cut a large chunk of money, that's kind of really where you turn, is to those spots where you can find that savings. Next slide. In fiscal year 2019, 0 states reported making mid-year budget reductions due to a revenue shortfall. Then once we got to fiscal year 2020, and we saw 19 states who needed to make budget cuts mid-year. And then, as I mentioned, we've seen 10 states report making budget cuts post-enactment due to revenue shortfalls. Next slide.
Another question we receive often is how states have used their rainy day funds and other various tools to manage their budgets. Next slide. So before I go into some of those tools, though, I wanted to take a moment to run through some other quick notes about some variation in state budget calendars in particular, and also how the implications that had for following state budget actions last year into this year. So I talked earlier about the variations in state revenue forecasting and how that had impacts on how quickly some states acted to adjust their budgets in response to COVID-19. But more broadly speaking, differing state budget calendars also had an effect on this. For example, 30 states follow an annual budget process, whereas 20 states budget primarily on a biennial basis or every 2 years. There are some nuances here. So some annual budget states, for example, will still put out revenue and expenditure forecasts beyond the annual budget cycle. And you have some biennial budget states that still have an extensive supplemental budget process that they follow in the mid-biennium. But still, this distinction is important in understanding how some states responded with their budgets last year. A note that out of the 20 biennial budget states, 17 will consider and pass 2-year budgets during this year's legislative sessions. Another note is that some states generally pass budgets pretty early in the year, just based on their budget calendars, as early as February or March in some cases. This resulted in some states enacting their fiscal year 21 budgets before the pandemic even hit last year. And meanwhile, you have other states that routinely go until June, for example, which is the last month of the fiscal year for most states. And it was helpful to understand these nuances when following state budget actions last year, and will continue to be helpful going forward. Another note, I mentioned the fiscal year calendar. So most states operate on a fiscal year that runs from July 1st through June 30th, but a few states do follow a different fiscal year. So New York starts on April 1st, Texas on September 1st, and Michigan and Alabama start on October 1st. Once again, these calendar variations had an impact on when states took certain actions in response to COVID-19 to balance their budgets. A quick aside, Brian mentioned how our budget processes in the states report is among the publications on our website. And this report goes into a lot of these details and presents 50 state information in more detail. And our last edition, still available on our website, was produced in 2015, but we will have an upcoming edition of that report coming out later this year. Next slide. So jumping back to our question about the other tools, the various tools states use to balance their budgets and address forecasted or actual shortfalls, Here's a display of some of the most common strategies that states reported in our fiscal survey as using to help manage their budgets in the middle of fiscal year 2020 and in their enacted or revised budgets for fiscal year 21. So of course, these included spending cuts, mostly targeted cuts, but some across the board as well, personnel actions such as hiring freezes, furloughs, and layoffs, and as well as one-time measures, which include things like rainy day funds, other fund transfers, using prior year balances, and so forth. Only a few states reported using revenue increases so far to close gaps, and a few other strategies that were used by some states included reducing local aid or making Medicaid program changes. Some states also reported using federal assistance to offset some eligible general fund costs related to pandemic response and relief efforts. Next slide. So one tool that I thought I'd dive more into is states' use of rainy day funds and look at the data we have on that. So before COVID-19, states' rainy day funds were at an all-time high after a decade of rebuilding reserves following the Great Recession. And as states have coped with revenue declines and increased spending demands due to COVID-19, these rainy day funds are serving as a critical budget management tool for some states. It is, of course, important to remember that coming into the crisis, reserve levels did vary by state, but total rainy day fund balances as a percentage of general fund spending, when you look at all 50 states combined, declined from 9.1% in fiscal year 2019 to a projected 7.8% in fiscal year 21. The median rainy day fund balance, though, which is shown here with the green line, did not yet record a decline in our report, but it's important to note that usage of rainy day funds in fiscal year 21 is ongoing and balance projections are subject to change. But another reason we haven't necessarily seen as steep of declines as you might expect is if a state relies too heavily on its rainy day fund or other one-time measures, this can tend to make budgeting the following year that much more difficult since those one-time measures are no longer available. So therefore, states tend to rely on an assortment of budget strategies like we just reviewed in the previous slide to balance and address shortfalls in response to a downturn. And another thing I would note is that states are tapping their rainy day funds unevenly, and this is in part due to the uneven impacts of the pandemic. And along those lines, I'll now turn it over to Brian to talk about some of the more recent revenue developments and why some states may be faring better than others.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So, bottom line, what we've seen with state revenues recently is that we have seen some improvements, but by and large, state revenues have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. So states haven't fully recovered and states aren't out of the woods yet. That being said, there are several reasons why we have seen improvements. Basically, what we saw was immediately after coronavirus spread throughout the country in that spring 2020 period, we saw a number of states sharply reduce their revenue forecasts. Some states are anticipating up to 20% revenue declines. And by and large, those level of revenue declines have not occurred. So revenues, for the most part, have come in above levels that states were anticipating after the outbreak of COVID-19. But as I noted, in most instances, they aren't back to the levels where they were pre-COVID-19. So getting into the reasons why we have seen some revenue improvements, one of the large reasons has been due to the federal stimulus measures that have already been passed. Those measures have helped to pump a lot of money into the economy. So things like the PPP loans, the enhanced unemployment, the stimulus checks, all those have helped to prop up the economy. And since state revenues are so closely tied to what's going on to the overall national economy, they have also helped to lessen the decline in state revenues. Looking at specific revenue sources, on the personal income tax side, one of the reasons why we haven't seen as much of a decline is that the downturn has largely impacted low-income workers and low-wage workers. We really haven't seen much of an impact, or in some instances, any impact on the wealthy. And states that rely heavily on high-income earners and more progressive income tax structures really haven't seen the decline in personal income taxes since the impact has been more felt on the low-wage workers. But related to that, since the impact has been felt more on low-wage workers, we have seen increased spending demands, especially in areas like social services, but also in other areas like public health, workforce development, the need to retrain people, all of those sort of areas, we've seen increased spending demands. On the sales tax side, Shelby alluded to this a little bit before. One of the reasons why sales taxes has fared better than initially anticipated has been because of the Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago now, South Dakota versus Wayfair, that allowed states greater latitude in taxing online sales. And as people shifted their behavior and started purchasing a lot more goods online, states were able to capture that revenue in sales taxes. It's also interesting too, because before COVID-19 hit, there had been this movement in states to try to broaden sales tax bases, kind of with this understanding that in a lot of ways, the sales tax system hadn't kept up with the time and needed to be modernized because the economy was shifting more towards services than goods, and states really weren't taxing services. But with this downturn, where you saw the impact was much more so on services than goods. So where people cut back their spending had been in the areas where states weren't collecting taxes for in the first place to a large degree. So that's another reason why we haven't seen the impact. But also, as Shelby mentioned earlier, we often see a lag in between when a recession hits and when state revenues are fully impacted. Some of that has to do with timing issues, especially in the personal income tax side. If you think about when you made your tax returns last year in 2020, it was really based on the 2019 economy. And when people make their tax returns this year in 2021, it's going to be based on the 2020 economy, which was clearly much weaker than what we saw in 2019. So we often see this trend in different downturns. We saw this during the Great Recession. We also saw it to a certain extent to the recession, the bursting of the tech bubble in the early 2000s as well, where there's a decline in the full impact in state revenues versus when a recession begins. Next slide. So getting into a little bit of what states have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and I'll go on to the next slide. So all states have been impacted, but they've been impacted in differing ways and varying magnitudes. So it hasn't been, the impact hasn't been felt the same way by all the different states. Some of the states that were most heavily hit are the states, not surprisingly, that rely heavily on tourism and hospitality as people started traveling less. Those sort of states were, really impacted. Also, the energy producing states were impacted by the decline in price of oil and natural gas. So the energy producing states were dealing with both the declines in the overall national economy and also with declines in the energy sector. We have seen some rebounding now with oil prices, but they're still down below some levels that we were seeing before the pandemic hit. There are some other areas where some different sectors where we were seeing more of an impact, but those impacts have lessened now. Things like manufacturing that came down initially when COVID-19 first started hitting, but manufacturing is by and large rebounded. Some of the other reasons for differences in how states are impacted can be based on their unemployment rate, how much COVID-19 has impacted, how many people have been inflicted with COVID-19. Another thing that can impact it is how states' revenues are structured. So states that rely heavily on sales taxes tend to see the impact of the downturn first. Since sales taxes, you start to see immediate declines if people cut back on spending. Sales tax data is reported more often than personal income taxes. So here, once again, that's why we often see variation in personal income taxes. You don't see the impact till later on. But as I mentioned earlier, even though that, all states are being impacted, and they're being impacted in different ways, one thing that we have seen fairly consistently is the disproportionate impact of this downturn on low-income workers that has led to increased spending demands in a number of areas. Next slide. I believe Shelby's going to hit on another question that we get quite often.
Whoops, I forgot to unmute myself. We can just pause for a minute before Catherine talks about this slide. I wanted to address really quickly some of the things that we hear over and over about how states have used their federal assistance and what's the status of states spending on the coronavirus relief fund. And a lot of times what we'll, the questions we'll get are, why haven't states spent more? What's taking so long? Or what are some of the hurdles states have faced? And so a lot of what we're seeing is there were numerous pots of money allocated for states from the federal government for COVID-19 response. And what states are doing is they're prioritizing those different pots of money as well. So you may see some that maybe haven't been touched yet, that because states have, like, a good example of this is that the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, initially had a very early expenditure deadline. So it had to be spent by the end of last calendar year. And so states were prioritizing spending from that pot of money before drawing from other pots of money to make sure that they fully utilized all of the resources they were going to have to respond to the pandemic. So we do see some of that. We also see that some pots of money are easier to use than others. We're in a disaster situation. So if the funding is flexible, easier to get on the ground, you don't have to do a lot of things up front. You don't have to put together a lengthy spend plan to get approved by the feds before you can access those funds. Those funds are going to be used first. We also see there's this lag time in reporting expenditures to the federal government. So a lot of times people will look at the reporting and say, hey, you haven't spent very much. But there's a window of time that states are spending, then they're reporting to the federal government. So what we try to look at a lot of times, particularly with CRF, is how much have the states allocated, which is how much have they prioritized towards certain areas of the budget, even if it hasn't been spent yet. And in January, when we talked to states, 97% of state territory CRF had been allocated. And also, on average, 77% of those funds had been expended. So there's a lag time where that hadn't been reported to the federal government yet, but states were definitely spending those funds, getting them out the door, and getting them to the areas that they were best used. So I'll go ahead and pass off to Catherine on this, because I know we want to get to questions soon. So we'll try to get through our next slide somewhat quickly.
Sure. Yeah. So one reason I just wanted to touch on another budget processes element that led some states to spend down their coronavirus relief funds faster than others, or at least allocate them faster, is really the variation in how much authority governors have to spend unanticipated federal funds without legislative approval. So most states do have at least some authority to do this, executive branch authority. But there are usually restrictions on this. Meanwhile, you do have some states where the legislature had to meet and approve the allocation of funds. Of course, this was further complicated by public health restrictions that made it difficult in many cases for lawmakers to convene quickly. The executive branch's ability, I would also note, to reduce the budget varies by state. In some cases, once again, only lawmakers have the authority to reduce the budget or withhold appropriations. So this is another aspect of differing state budget laws and procedures that really had an impact on the variation we saw in state activity, budget activity in response to COVID-19 last year. Next slide.
And I'll just add to one thing that you're probably seeing a lot related to what Catherine was just talking about is some changes to that in the states, where if a governor, I know I've seen that quite a bit, where if a governor had the authority to spend these large buckets of funds that came during the crisis, and the legislature didn't have as much input as they would have liked. I think we're seeing some proposals to change that. So I'm sure you're all reporting on that quite a bit. So we'll just wrap up with kind of, what's the outlook for state budgets looking ahead. And I would say it's better, and be a little cautiously optimistic there. The two words that I keep coming back to over and over, I sound like a broken record, are it's uneven and uncertain. As we've talked about, we've seen that most states have been able to avoid the severe budget cuts, through rainy day funds, federal assistance, one-time measures, but there's definitely challenges that lie ahead. Better revenue projections are a bright spot for state budget officers and states, and vaccines are offering reasons for optimism for all of us. But of course, there's challenges with effective vaccine distribution and related steps to control the spread of the virus. And new variants are a cause for concern. And of course, any surge in cases has an economic impact. And even as the state tax revenues do begin to recover from those declines induced by the pandemic, rising spending demands from that uneven economic recovery are expected to put added pressure on the budget. While the fact that lower income workers have been hit harder maybe has protected state income tax collections a bit, it also does increase those spending demands, as Brian mentioned, on our counter-cyclical programs like unemployment, Medicaid, TANF, and others. And of course, we have that lagging collections issue that kind of has state budget officers holding their breath a little bit, unsure exactly what's going to happen in the future. And there's a lot of questions around the impact of tax deductibility of PPP expenses, those sorts of things. So there's still a lot of uncertainty, still a lot of unevenness from state to state and from worker to worker, family to family. So we'll continue to monitor that. States are watching really closely and watching developments at the federal level and hoping that can also help smooth things out a little bit. And we'll I think we right here on time. We'll transition to, we've got 30 minutes for Q&A, and would love to hear what's on your minds.
Yes, I'm quite impressed. Exactly 45 minutes. I'll say in a few years of speakers that never happens. So congratulations for being the best, the most compliant speakers out there. I appreciate that. So we will go to Lauren Gibbons first, then Jillian, and then Stephen Caruso.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Lauren Gibbons with MLive in Michigan. And one thing that
Lauren, we're having trouble. I'm having trouble hearing Lauren. Everybody else having trouble also?
Yeah. Maybe we could use the chat function.
It's just the microphone was like.
Can you hear me now? I tried a couple things. Otherwise, I can chat it.
Yeah, I'd say let's put it in chat. It's hard. It's distorted. So put that in chat. We'll cut to that as soon as you have it in there. But let's go to Jillian.
Just in regards to rainy day funds or economic stabilization funds, like how do they differ from, like, I guess I'm thinking of like a banking account. You have your general banking account and then you have your savings account. And is that kind of how the rainy day funds operate? Like, are they a savings account? And if that's the case, like, is somebody collecting interest off that or no?
Catherine, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great analogy. I actually just used that the other day with someone. So, when looking at a state's reserves or total balances, because our reports do collect data on total balances, which look at both rainy day funds as well as state's general fund balances. And a state's, ending balance or prior year ending balance may be viewed a little more like a checking account and the rainy day fund as more of a savings account. And generally speaking, when turning to these reserves in times of an economic downturn or other unexpected fiscal stress, a state will often draw down on its prior year balance, the checking account, if you will, first and really save their rainy day fund for when it's really needed. There are typically rules in place for how to withdraw, how a state may withdraw from its rainy day fund, under what conditions. And also often they have payback requirements, so how quickly they have to restore whatever has been used out of the rainy day fund. And another action that we've seen, a policy development or trend that we've seen in recent years is more states tying their rainy day fund balances and deposit rules to revenue volatility levels. So how volatile the revenue sources are. But yeah, depending on where and how it's stored, interest may be an element of how you might see, slight increases. But we don't generally hear too much consideration on that point. I don't know if Brian or Shelby have anything to add on that specifically.
I'll just add that, because I heard this in the question, that generally states would receive interest on those funds and on their general funds as well.
All right, let's go to Stephen Caruso.
Hi, I'm Stephen. I'm covering Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Capital Star. I'm just curious, you had that graph about how states were balancing their budget. How many states, like, I guess, and you had a couple different most recent with one-time funds, because like in Pennsylvania, we'd had like a couple of those things you described, basically like pushing payments off using federal dollars. And I'm wondering, like, are we alone in like, putting the weight of balancing the most recent budget pretty much entirely on one-time maneuvers?
So we've definitely seen a mix of strategies used, and quite a few states actually turned to some one-time measures. I think in the case, and this may apply, I believe does apply in Pennsylvania's case, in fiscal year 2020, you actually saw a number of states use one-time measures, specifically also due to the impact of the tax deadline shift. So that shift from April to July 15th as the filing deadline that states did in following what the federal government did, led a number of states to recognize that revenue in the fiscal year 21 instead of fiscal year 20. And I believe Pennsylvania was among those. There were about 19 states that recognized the revenue in the subsequent year, so later than they expected. And so some states may have used one-time budget actions to close their budgets for fiscal year 20, but knowing that they were going to get this influx of revenue in 21 that otherwise would have been collected in 20, was it not for the tax deadline shift. So that's another thing to look at in terms of seeing why some states may have relied, particularly in fiscal year 20, on some of those one-time actions.
And I would add to that too, that it is in time of a crisis, that is when you turn to one-time measures. You don't want to be doing one-time measures to balance your budget in good years. But obviously, one-time federal aid or, that's what a rainy day account's for, is to get you through those times. And a lot of times you'll use the rainy day fund to smooth out cuts and get to where the economy is recovering and you have ongoing revenue to cover things again. States also use short-time measures toward the end of a fiscal year to balance their budget. So maybe they won't do a layoff, for instance, but some of the quick things you see are travel bans and hiring freezes when, so we'll just leave those vacant positions open and hope we can hire them in the future, but let's not spend the money now. Let's wait and, maximize those funds, or let's hold off on a construction project or other one-time spending to get through those downturns. So it's a pretty normal and acceptable practice to do that to get through a crisis. Like I said, long-term, you want to have structural balance, but short-term, it's kind of how you patch it all together.
let's go to Stacy next, and tell the speakers where you're from too.
Sure. Thank you. So my name is Stacy Barchinger. I'm a reporter with the Bergen Record and the Gannett papers across New Jersey. I actually kind of have two questions. I don't know, Chris, if I can ask them both quickly or just one, but
I think we're fine.
okay. So I guess my first one is talking about one-time revenues. New Jersey borrowed last year about 10% of its budget to get through coronavirus, and I wonder how many states, if you have an idea, did bonding to provide that one-time revenue. And then my second question was kind of more forward-looking. We are doing our 22 budget now, just got started, and it didn't factor in any federal assistance. Obviously, that is still being debated, and we don't exactly know what it would be coming states' way, but I wonder if it would be, I was kind of surprised just to not see that in the budget plan. And I wonder if that's normal or what you would expect to see maybe.
I can take the second question first.
Okay.
That so generally your budget is built upon things that are known. So current law, current things that are happening. So a state wouldn't assume federal aid if they didn't know it was coming. That can obviously be really dangerous too if you assume. I think last spring and summer, we thought it was a given that states were going to get aid and it was going to happen then. So if that had been assumed and states would have set budgets on that and not taken other actions, they would have been in a lot of trouble. So you don't want to make those assumptions. And also in some cases, by law, states are not allowed to. They have to set their budgets based on current law and current projections and things that are known. Catherine, do you have anything to add to that since you studied the budget processes across states?
No, other than, one thing we did see some states do last year is they had certain triggers in place where maybe they did not assume additional federal aid, but if aid was provided, then these cuts would be restored, or these tax increases wouldn't take place, or something like that. So that's just another way, but that's I think more the exception than the rule. You don't see those used terribly often because it's pretty complicated to budget that way.
And I can try to take a stab at the borrowing question. Typically what we see is states, they don't borrow for ongoing spending. We typically see borrowing for things like infrastructure and capital projects. That is, if you're doing long-term borrowing. We do see states often borrow for spending if they're going to pay it back, like perhaps by the end of the budget. Some states will issue what's called revenue anticipation notes or tax anticipation notes, kind of doing with the variances in when states receive their revenues. So they might not be receiving their revenue towards the end of the fiscal year after April collection. So they're borrowing the short term and then pay it back. We did see a handful of states take advantage, not many, of the Federal Reserve program that was passed. Remember now if that's part of the CARES Act or a different coronavirus relief bill, but the MLF, the municipal lending facility that allows states to borrow. We didn't see too many states take advantage of that. Some states felt that the interest rates were too high, but that was one way where we did see states borrow some where they typically wouldn't borrow in that manner. So that was directly precipitated by COVID-19 and the impact on states.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I am going to channel Lauren Gibbons here since her microphone wasn't working right. I'm Lauren Gibbons with MLive in Michigan. You mentioned how many initial states' consensus revenue estimates were quite a bit more dire than what ultimately transpired. Can we expect those estimates to get a little more accurate now that we're a year into the pandemic, or the unknowns of future federal relief still going to complicate those projections?
I guess I could take a stab at that one too. Yeah, I think it's still going to be complicated. States are going to be closely watching what happens with April tax returns. They're going to be watching what happens on the federal level as far as if there's going to be additional federal aid. And, there's also, still, as Shelby mentioned earlier, there's still a great deal of uncertainty what's going to happen with the national economy and how quickly things do get at least back to a semblance of normal. How fast the vaccines are distributed, if these variants, could lead to personal future, shutting down of the economy and kind of gone back to where we were. So there is still a great deal of uncertainty, and states are going to have to factor that in their revenue forecasts. What we're not seeing right now is states forecasting the level of revenue declines where they were immediately after the outbreak. So we're not seeing the level of declines forecasted that we saw, starting not quite last year this time, but in that April and May period. But it is still a very difficult environment for states to be forecasting revenue. So by and large, I think states are going to be very cautious when they come out with revenue forecasts and not try to be overly optimistic when they're needing to factor in all these uncertainties.
I would echo that same thing. We always say that those economic and revenue projections they're an art, not a science. It's difficult, and this has been. I know we all got really tired of the word unprecedented, but you build models around things that have happened before, and that's how the forecasting is done. And then when you have something that's never happened before, it's very difficult to have an accurate forecast. And I think what you'll see is if this current bill passes and states get some more flexible aid, that'll help smooth things out on the budget side. So the volatility of the revenue forecast won't be as big of a concern. If you miss your forecast, you're going to have this cushion of federal funds to help you through on the budget side, not on the revenue side. And there's a little bit more certainty seen ahead with some of the things in the bill of the economic stimulus, of unemployment payments and things that are happening. But some of the but then there are all these small little things that I think can really impact how states are, how their revenue will come in. And so then how accurate those will be. Things like where people are living and working now. We've seen that those cross-state issues of where people have been taxed where they're working, but now they're working from home. And are they going to stay working from home and shift their income tax to a different state because of that? People are moving around. All of those things are going to have these impacts that are really difficult to see right now, because it's not just things about the economy necessarily, it's human behavior, right? Which I guess is that's economics. What are we going to spend? Are we going to travel again? Even if it's safe and we're all vaccinated, how long before we feel comfortable? So all of those things have to be taken into account. And I think it's just really difficult to know really kind of what the world looks like around the corner. And that all plays into revenue forecasting and what people are doing. All
right. So we have 15 minutes. I have 7 folks in line. So if the speakers could maybe just one of you grab the next answers, and everybody kind of tighten up the answers just a little bit and the questions just a little bit, we'll be able to get everybody in. We're going to go to Ethan, Lisa, Mayan, Stephen Gruber Miller, Anna, James, and Jarvis. So Ethan first.
Hi there, I'm Ethan DeWitt, a reporter at the Concord Monitor newspaper in New Hampshire. I'm working on a story right now looking at the increases to state police budgeting in our state and kind of public safety in general. And I think besides dealt with this. But I wanted to get a sense of, in our state, those are being increased by 10%, the expenditures, and expenditures on education are being decreased by 8%. And I'm wondering if that's a trend nationally. Does it have anything to do with the pandemic?
Okay, Ethan, we're having trouble hearing you. Your sound also.
Your sense of other states?
Ethan, We've kind of lost you, Ethan, so if you can maybe submit yours by chat.
Their police budget. Why is
Fine. He hears you. He wrote in chat, Chris. It's just still
Okay.
going.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that, Ethan. If you can submit it in chat, we'll get your question in next as soon as you submit it. But let's go to Lisa right now.
Hey, can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I just had a question off something you guys said towards the end, about the governors having authority, kind of broad authority to spend during the crisis, and legislatures were now starting to take some action or put in some proposals about that. I was just curious what those were, because my legislature looks like they're trending toward that, but hasn't actually done it yet. So I was just curious what you guys had seen so far.
Well, I don't know if Brian has some specifics he can recall from doing our press clips. I've kind of just seen it broadly, and so I can't really give you specific examples off the top of my head. I just know I've seen that legislatures want to be more involved.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I mean, it definitely varies on state practices, but I mean, I think the bottom line is it would require more legislative approval before, doing whatever the governor was hoping to do. So, I mean, that's really what's more focused on, and that, immediately after the pandemic, the governors had some instances granted, and some instances already had a lot of flexibility of, how they were going to go about addressing the pandemic. And now the legislature has tried to get more involved in, a number of instances, and, basically have to run things through the legislature before decisions are made.
Okay, let's, so we got Ethan's question here. In New Hampshire, our state police budget, public safety expenditures are proposed to be increased in our governor's proposed budget about 10%, while public education is set to be cut about 8%. Is this a trend you're seeing in other states? And if so, what have you seen that might explain that? Is it related to the pandemic?
We have seen increased demands in the public safety area, directly related to the pandemic. For the state level, when you're talking about public safety, you're talking more about highway patrol, and then, largely prisons and corrections. So you're not talking about local police departments. Those are more at the local levels, but we have seen increased demands in that area. States have utilized a lot of the CARES Act funds to deal with some of those increased costs in public safety. So I can't comment specifically on New Hampshire, but it might be an issue of using federal funds for some of that, or possibly they were Ethan mentioned K-12. There's increased federal funds now in K-12, so they might be using federal funds there and reducing some state spending. So, it could be one possibility.
Yeah, I would just quickly, I know we're trying to stay to one speaker, but I would look at whether it's a general fund cut being offset by federal expenditures. And then we also saw education take advantage of some savings of not operating their buildings. And so you might have seen some expenditures or anticipated expenditures come down a bit as they transition to online learning.
Okay, so let's go to Maayan next.
Hey, Maayan at the state newspaper in South Carolina. I think my question was answered about bonds, but I'm curious whether you all have seen how states' budgets have functioned state to state in terms of the states that quote unquote closed due to COVID, issued stricter restrictions versus the ones that didn't. Like here in South Carolina, we never really, shut down. Our budget seems to be okay next to the state of Georgia, which has seen budget cuts. I'm just curious whether you all have seen any kind of trends in that area.
Yeah, I think by and large, the bigger factors have been some of the things we discussed earlier as far as what kind of make up their economy. And they rely heavily on things like hospitality or tourism or the energy sector, those sort of things, in their tax structure, actions they've taken as far as how much they're keeping their economy open, is one factor. But I think some of the other bigger factors we've seen are, kind of other things on what their overall economy has relied on, and kind of the makeup of their population, all sorts of different factors such as that.
Okay, so let's try to get, we've got 4 more questions. I think we can get them through if we have the answers fairly quick. But we'll have, we have Stephen Gruber Miller, then Anna, then James, then Jarvis. So Stephen?
Hi, Stephen Gruber Miller at the Des Moines Register. I'm curious if you're seeing this in other states. Iowa's budget was maybe in a better place than other states, and they're looking at the possibility of doing some tax cuts later this year. I wonder if there are any other states that are in that position.
Brian, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. No, we have seen some other states make tax cut proposals. I don't have an exact figure off the top of my head, but what we're seeing that's some extent with the tax cut proposals is that they're kind of geared towards trying to help individuals and businesses impacted by the downturn. So that's one thing we're seeing. And then for some of the states, as far as tax cuts, they're doing, so those are like more targeted tax cuts. And for states that we're seeing more broad-based tax cut proposals, many of those are ones that are designed to be phased in. So, state might have a goal of eventually eliminating their personal income tax, but for the first year, starting off with very minimal declines in personal income tax rates and trying to increase the declines moving forward. And in some instances, those future tax cuts will be precipitated on what's going on with the national, or not the national economy, the state economy and state revenues. As states' revenues are continuing to grow, would it allow for further reductions in taxes?
Okay, so Anna, was your question answered, or do you still have one?
It was answered for the most part, but I'm still a little bit unclear, and I'll read that link that was shared, whether, the education budget writers are now talking about, if we get $3 billion in aid to education, they're like, well, we don't need that much for schools, that they're good. And so let's use it for other things and other programs like transportation or other projects that might have hurt. Is there language in that link or in the Federal CARES Act package where it says, you have to use this percentage for this pot of money, or could lawmakers have a say on exactly what percentage they need for whatever they want?
Catherine, do you want to talk about the education money?
Sure. So real quickly, and a caveat, the link I had shared was really more to the question about legislative authority more generally, and executive trying to take some budget powers away from the executive. But regarding education funds from the federal government, the law does specify what those funds can be used for within the realm of education, and particularly the increased costs due to COVID-19, and addressing some of the indirect costs related to that. And then there are also maintenance of effort requirements associated with the education funding that states are beholden to. So maintaining their support for education at a certain baseline level. So there are quite a few restrictions in there regarding the ed funds that happy to answer more detailed questions offline on that, if that'd be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Thank you.
All right, so let's go to James and then Jarvis, and I think that's all we have time for.
Yeah, here in Texas, our governor got some criticism for not spending the CARES Act funds more quickly. And that stretched like into December, when I know that was the initial deadline for spending on that. But I'm just wondering, just based on what you all said in the presentation, I mean, would there, and we've asked him as well, we just have not gotten an answer, but would there be a prudent budgetary reasons for not spending that money? I mean, is he looking for, and we're on biennial legislative sessions. So, I mean, is that a prudent thing to do? I'm just wondering, what would be the reasons for holding off to spend?
If you're, I assume you're talking about the coronavirus relief fund dollars, probably helping.
Yes.
I don't think Texas is alone, in a lot of states really assumed that the expenditure deadline would get extended for another year. And so some budgetary, and I can't speak to Texas, I don't know the situation enough to know exactly why it may have happened there, but that could be very prudent if you saw that the need was going to be in the next year. So that can be something that comes along with the delay of income taxes, for instance, that could hit the next year. A lot of people weren't sure where that was going to come, or they could be assuming the expenses are going to be in the out year, that there'll be maybe other monies covering some of the pandemic expenses in the current year. They could prioritize those pots of money differently.
Okay, and final question to Jarvis.
Hi, a couple of you mentioned the South Dakota versus Wayfair decision and how that has kind of stemmed the loss of sales taxes that may have been expected. Was there any effect of that ruling seen before this pandemic, or has it been primarily seen because so many more people now can't go out to physical stores?
No, there was impact before the pandemic as well. I think the impact is increased. So we did see a boost in sales tax revenues a little bit from states taxing online sales. And a lot of states, they, even after the Supreme Court decision, they had to pass their own rules and own laws, setting up systems to collect the online sales. So that took a while. So in some states, by the time they got it set up, it was almost when the pandemic hit. But yeah, it did lead for, more of an initial boost, before the pandemic hit. But now that increase has grown, considerably as people shifted more towards online sales.
And from spending on services to spending on goods as well.
Okay. All right, well, it's now 12:15 and we want to take a little break here, but I want to thank the three speakers very much for taking all the time to share your presentation and answer all these questions. Fellows, the NASBO folks are very open to being contacted by you after the fact. I see we have like one question that came in on chat afterwards, so you can reach out to them directly, or you can reach out to them through me, and we'll try to facilitate any other questions you have outstanding. But for Shelby and Brian and Catherine, I want to thank you very much.